Hello, my name is Jeffrey and I'm a Kase ambassador and I'm going to talk about Kase filters. But before we dive into that, let's talk a little bit about exposure fundamentals. Because anytime you use a filter, whether it be a polarizing filter or an ND filter, it is going to have an impact on the exposure of your scene. So it's very important to understand your exposure fundamentals before getting into using filters. That'll help you have the most successful results as you start to either put single filters on the front of your lens or multiple filters if you're trying to stack maybe a circular polarizer and an ND filter. So let's talk about the 3 things that impact your exposure and one of my favorite tools to make sure you're getting a proper exposure. So the 3 main camera settings of getting a proper exposure are your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO. Those are all 3 elements and settings on the camera that will change how the camera exposes your image. Think of them as sort of like levers that you can change to get what you want. Now there's different decisions to make with each one of those settings depending on what you want out of your scene. So let's talk a little bit about each one of those 3, some of the things you want to consider as you're choosing your setting, and then we'll dive into a couple tools that the camera has to help you get a proper exposure of your landscape scene. Okay, so the first setting we're going to talk about is shutter speed. And that is the shutter inside your camera. You choose how long that shutter stays open. The longer the shutter stays open, the more light that comes in and hits the sensor and the camera. The shorter it stays open, the less light that gets in. So you can control how much light is getting into your camera by how long the shutter stays open. But the shutter also has some other influences on what's happening in your image. For example, a fast shutter speed can stop motion. So for example, if you're out on a windy day and photographing some grass or leaves or anything like that, or maybe even flowers, and the wind is blowing, you're going to need a slightly faster shutter speed in order to keep that motion from being visible in your still image. So keep that in mind as you're photographing a scene and pay attention to is there wind or anything like that that's going to move elements in your scene. Now, if you're photographing a rocky desert landscape with very little plants or trees or anything like that in it, then you can do a little slower shutter speed because the wind's not going to move that rock or the cliffs or anything like that. The other element is the slower the shutter speed, it'll show off motion. And you can use that to create an effect, maybe when photographing water or waterfalls or seashores or anything like that, because you can leave the shutter open. And that's sort of how you get that nice, milky, smooth effect in water, whether it be a stream cascading over rocks, a waterfall. So as you look at a scene, those are some of the things you need to think about when you're trying to determine what shutter speed do you want. The other piece with shutter speed is you can only handhold so still. So as you start to get into longer shutter speeds, camera motion will impact the sharpness of your image, which is why a lot of landscape photographers use tripods, is because we're trying to keep all of our settings for a nice, clean, detailed, crisp image, and a tripod helps us shoot with lower shutter speeds in those types of situations. So shutter speed is one element that we can choose from when we're trying to get a proper exposure. So the other element that you can change on your camera is the aperture. And what that controls is it controls the size of the opening in the diaphragm and the lens. So that opening inside the lens is going to let more light in or less light in. The higher the aperture, say something like f14, f16, is going to be a smaller opening, so less light gets into the lens. Something like an f2.8 means that opening is going to be a little wider, a little more open, and more light will get into the lens. So it has an impact on your exposure for that image. Now for landscape photographers, there's another element called depth of field to consider. And depth of field is how sharp the image is from front to back of the image. And that changes depending on your aperture setting. An aperture setting like f2.8, where the opening in the lens is wider, the depth of field is actually shallower. You have a smaller range, a smaller plane of sharpness within that image from front to back from the camera. Whereas if you start bumping up into f11, f16, that depth of field gets wider. So from front to back, more is in focus. So that's a consideration when you're looking at your scene and deciding what settings you want to use for your camera is depth of field. If you're trying to isolate a subject, maybe you're photographing a flower against a busy garden and you want the emphasis to be on the flower, you might want that shallower depth of field to keep the flower in focus and blur out that background. So you'll be getting more light in the camera and you'll be getting the sharpness range that you want. But maybe you're photographing a waterfall scene and you want things sharp from front to back. So you're going to move your aperture to something like f11, f16, something like that. Now your depth of field is much wider, so you're getting more things in focus from front to back of the scene, but you're getting less light into the camera. So that's the thing to keep in mind with aperture. You need to decide what depth of field am I looking for my scene, and then based on that setting, am I letting more light into the camera or less light in the camera, because it's going to impact the exposure. And the third setting that can influence your exposure in the camera is ISO. And what this is it's how the camera handles the light hitting the sensor. For landscape photographers and things like that, we like to be down around ISO 100, ISO 200, maybe ISO 64 if your camera will allow it. Because what that does is it lets the camera get nice, clean data, very little noise, and it starts you off from a very good base image to have nice, crisp, high image quality. However, sometimes you need a little bit more light from your scene because you've got your aperture set and you've got your shutter speed set and you need to play with the ISO setting. So as you turn the ISO up on the camera, say you go from 200 to 640 or 800, there is a chance it can start to introduce some noise into the image, especially the higher you go. Modern day cameras do much better at this for those base ranges of ISO, but still, even as you get up into ISO 1600, ISO 3200, you can start to introduce this noise because it's boosting that light signal and it's starting to take any kind of artifact in that signal and make it worse as well. So you do need to be careful with your ISO if you boost it too high for the noise you're introducing to the image, just something to be aware of. But if it's what you need to do in order to stop the motion and get the depth of field you want, and ISO is what you need to bump up, it's fine to do it. The key is be aware of what's happening with ISO when you turn it up and what it's doing to your image quality. So those are the three camera settings that impact the exposure of your image on your camera: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. So how do you know when you're changing those elements what the camera is seeing? So there are two tools on the camera that can help you gauge your exposure while you're changing settings on it. The first one is the light meter, but it's important to understand how the light meter works. So let's talk about that real quick. So the light meter, what it's doing is as the scene's coming in and the light's hitting the sensor and you're looking at it on the back of the LCD, there's a little bar down there and it's got a section in 0 and then it goes over to like usually 3 stops too bright, 3 stops underexposed, and it's showing you where your exposure is falling on that, whether it's underexposed or overexposed. And the goal is to try to get it right down around 0 with some exceptions. But what the meter is doing, it's sort of turning your whole scene into a gray toned image. And it's trying to balance everything from the darks to the lights, so that it works out to be in what's called an 18% gray. And that's how much light is getting reflected off the scene. It's trying to balance 18% gray and average that whole scene out. Why 18% gray? Because visually and perceptually, that's what looks like it's right in between the darks and the lights when you're looking at something. It's right in the middle, 18% gray. But that's what the camera sensor is doing. But the camera sensor is really not that smart. So take, for example, if you're looking at a scene that has lots of snow in it, lots of white, lots of bright. Well, the light meter is trying to balance that out to 18% gray, but you want most of it being bright white snow. But what the camera's trying to do is it's actually going to underexpose the image and pull it back, and it's going to turn your snow into more of a gray, because that's what the light meter is trying to do. If you're setting your exposure so that the light meter has it at 0, the camera's saying, well, that's where 18%, that midpoint of gray is. So you end up with an underexposed image, makes your snow look dull and gray. Similarly, if you say point just, for example, at a black wall, point your camera at it, and you're trying to balance that light meter so it's right on the 0. The camera's trying to bring that up. It's trying to bring it up because it's like that scene should be 18% gray. It doesn't realize that's actually black. It should be dark, and it's okay to not hit that 18% because most of the scene is dark. But what the camera meters do, what it's directing you to get to that 0, is it's trying to bring the exposure up. So you're going to overexpose that black, and it's not going to be black like it should be. So that's what the light meter is doing, and that's why it can cause some problems, is because you sort of need to know what is in your scene so that you can make the proper adjustments, because the light meters will sometimes have a tendency to overexpose or underexpose the image. So for example, if you're looking at a scene of snow and you know it's bright, you're going to want to overexpose the image a little bit according to the light meter, because you're trying to bring that gray up to white. So you're going to overexpose so that what it thinks is middle gray is actually a little brighter and get you to that. So again, light meters are a valuable tool, but you need to know how it's working, what it's being influenced by, so that you can sort of use your own judgment on the times you're going to need to override the light meter and watch it and go for a little more overexposed or a little more underexposed so that it knows what to do. And just one more thing about light metering. Light metering, there are different light metering modes on your camera. They typically range from where the camera's going to look at the full scene. Nikon calls it matrix metering, Canon calls it evaluative metering, and some of the other camera brands call it multiple, but all of those are three ways of referring to the light meters looking at the whole scene. So that means it's going to evaluate all parts of the scene from corner to corner as the same to average it together. There's also a spot metering mode, which is it's going to look at a single point, a single little area, a single set of pixels, and it's going to meter based off of that. Same, that's what your light meter is going to be influenced by. It gives more priority to that spot. And there's also a center weighted mode, which is just essentially the center of the image is what it's going to try to meter more correctly. So that does influence how the light meter works as well. For landscape photography, I typically recommend the metering mode where it's going to look at the whole scene. So matrix metering, evaluative metering, multi, things like that, because I want the whole scene properly exposed, and I might do something in post to sort of fix it. But do be aware of metering modes can influence how the light meter reads as well. So the second tool that the camera has to use is the histogram. And the histogram is a graph of the tones in the image from darks to lights, and it sort of gives you a graph that, like, you know, it can hump over on the dark side if you've got a lot of darks in the image, or it can be just sort of right in the middle if you've got a nice well-balanced midtones, not a lot of darks, not a lot of highlights on that graph. So that's very useful because it doesn't depend on the metering mode. It does depend on you evaluating the scene with your own eyes and thinking about how it should look. But you can get an idea and see as you make setting changes on how it impacts that graph. Now, the histogram in most cameras can be enabled in live view, makes it super handy while you're composing your scene, changing camera settings to see it in real time change and move and help get your exposure. On cameras that don't have that, it's typically available in playback mode. So in that case, you take a picture, look at playback mode, look at the histogram after you've enabled it, determine if it's what you want. If not, make some camera setting changes, take another picture, and double check it again. A little easier in live view mode, but you're not out of luck if it's not available in your live view mode. Now, what I typically recommend is with the histogram is you want to expose towards the right without overexposing the image. If you overexpose the image, the highlights get blown out, you lose the detail, the camera didn't capture any detail, and there's really no saving that in post-processing. So usually I sort of pull the histogram to the right without blowing out the highlights, and that's going to get me to an image that's very workable in post-processing. So those are the two tools. Now, using what we learned earlier, shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, we can use those settings to watch either the light meter, or as I recommend, the histogram, to change the exposure of the image and be more confident that you're getting a well-exposed image. So for example, if you need more light in your scene because maybe the histogram is showing all bunched up over on the left-hand side, so it's a lot of darks, you're looking at the scene and it's not dark, you can slow your shutter speed down a little bit and you'll be able to watch that histogram move as you let more light in the camera and get it all set up nice on the screen. Maybe you're photographing some bright water and where it's cresting the cliff and falling off over the edge, it's really bright and you're seeing in your histogram that it's super bright and it's blown out. You're going to lose that detail, it's just not going to look good. Then you can maybe speed your shutter speed up or lower your ISO a bit, or maybe even bump that aperture up a bit. Maybe you were shooting at f11 and you want to let less light in the camera to sort of pull that histogram back. Kick up to f16 and then that'll bring it back in and get a well-exposed image. So using one of those tools, either the light meter or the histogram, I prefer the histogram, you can get a well-exposed image. So those are the basics of getting a good exposure. And it's important, I know we haven't even talked about filters yet, because when you put the filters on the camera, whether it's a circular polarizer, a polarizing filter, or an ND filter, it's going to change your exposure. So you need to know how to counteract that and change that to get the scene that you want. So highly recommend making sure you know where your light meter is at, making sure you can enable your histogram, practice using it. And just to help you with that, let's head out into the field and we're gonna sit and look at a scene and we're gonna play with the light meter and the histogram in a scene and using shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, and play with making some changes so you can sort of see how those work out in the field. Okay, so we're set up outside and we're going to work through those exposure fundamentals we talked about. And we're going to talk about shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, and using the histogram on the back of the camera to set your exposure properly. So I got this little scene set up, lots of ferns, lots of green, fairly even light. So it is going to be pretty simple to manipulate the histogram. I purposely chose a scene that's not high dynamic range just because it'll make it a little easier to see things and talk through instead of talking about some of the trouble cases. So like I said, let's dive in here, hop behind the camera, and I'm going to walk through setting a proper exposure. Then we're going to watch what happens to the histogram and the light meter as we change the shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Okay, so what we've got here in this scene is what I'd recommend first is look at the scene and see what you've got. And what we've got bright stuff here in this part of the frame, and we got dark shadows over there. So keeping in mind the camera and light meter is going to be trying to balance that out to an 18% gray. So what I've got on here now is we've got our histogram, we got the camera light meter, and this is my ISO, that's my aperture, and my shutter speed. So I'm ISO 100, aperture f9, and shutter speed of 1 second right now. And if we look at that histogram, it's actually pretty good. I'm not really bumping too far on the left, which is the dark, and I'm not bumping too far on my right and losing my highlights. So that's all good. So according to the histogram, I have a pretty well exposed image at these settings. However, if we look over at the light meter, it thinks I'm overexposing the image. And that's because it thinks this bright section all the way through here should be darker. So let's watch what happens if I use the light meter, the line on the side, to get it to 0, what it thinks. So it thinks it should be darker. So we're going to speed the shutter speed up. And it brings it there. But look what happened to our shadows back in there. We start to lose a lot of those shadows. They start to get a little bit muddy. So if we use the histogram, we bump it over right about there. We're back to 1 second. Aperture f9, ISO 100. We'll go ahead and take this shot. Actually find my focus point out there. And that's the image that we took with the histogram like that. Now, let's start making some setting changes. Let's see what happens if we increase the ISO. So we're at ISO 100. Let's go to ISO 400. Everything gets really bright. ISO 400, it's implying gain, it's digitally increasing the voltage to get it higher like that. And even my light meter says I'm overexposed, and my histogram says I'm overexposed. So say I want to shoot at ISO 400, maybe there's more wind today and those are moving, so I actually want a faster shutter speed. So by shifting that ISO to ISO 400, now I can speed my shutter speed up. And watch it increasing here. I'm watching my histogram. And that's a pretty good histogram again. We're at 1/4 of a second. My histogram's right there in between, not bumping on the right, so my brights are good, not losing my shadows on the left. Nice and good. So as you can see, by changing that shutter speed, you're able to change the histogram. I changed my ISO to ISO 400, which moved my histogram far, far to the right, way too far. I was losing highlights, so I speed my shutter speed up to reduce the amount of light. And again, a condition you might want to do that is if there's more of a breeze and those ferns and things were moving. So say I want more depth of field because this is a long scene from front to back. So I change my aperture to f9. Say I go to f16. So I set my aperture to f16. Notice what happened to the histogram. It went way far over there to the left, meaning I've got lots of darks, and I could allow more light into the camera. So again, what I can do here is change my shutter speed. I'm going to slow it down. Slowing down the shutter speed lets more light in the camera. I'm able to move my histogram over. So again, the histogram does a really good job at saying what data you have, and I trust it more than the light meter due to how the light meter is trying to take things to 18% gray. And let's take the ISO back down to 100. Now I'm letting less light into the camera, so I'm all stacked up on the left side. Let's decide this time I don't really want f16, but I want more like an f9 aperture. So bring my aperture down. F8 actually gets me looking good, so I was able to fix the histogram here by changing my aperture, opening it up, letting more light in, and fixing that histogram for properly exposed image. So that's how you use the histogram to set your proper exposure. As you saw, as we changed different settings, the ISO, the aperture, the shutter speed, we're able to influence what that histogram looks like. Now again, why this ties into filters is as soon as you start putting filters on the front of your lens, you start changing the exposure settings. A CPL filter will usually lose you about 1 stop, and ND filters by design are going to lose you between 3 stops, 6 stops, 10 stops, or anything in between. So as you put them on, you need to be able to read that histogram to change your exposure settings to be able to still maintain the proper exposure for your image. So hopefully you found this video helpful. Again, my name is Jeffrey. I'm a Kase ambassador. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out the other videos in this series.